Greetings, this is Kyle, aka AlienTude, coming in with another sword review. This time I'm going to be taking a look at the Valiant Armoury Hardwick. Before I begin, let me introduce myself. I'm a fantasy and computer geek who happens to really enjoy collecting functional swords. I have no training in martial arts, the use or making of swords, and I'm not well versed in history. I'm an enthusiast collector who is slowly learning how to use swords properly. This review will be about this specific sword. I've handled two other Valiant Armoury swords, but only briefly, and not enough to really affect my opinions on the Hardwick. It's possible that this sword is an outlier in their products, or it could be a perfect representation of the quality you can expect to receive. All I can really talk about with any degree of confidence is what I have direct experience with, this specific sword. So please keep all this in mind during this review. These are a novice's opinions about one sword he owns. I bought this sword from Cult of Athena in December of 2020 for $1,245 US. I was eyeing it for a few days and eventually decided I had to pull the trigger. I'd been looking for a high-end Type 14 sword, and I love the blue and brown color combination. Let's talk about Valiant Armoury for a bit. It's owned and operated by Sunny Subtles and is based out of Texas. Until fairly recently, their primary product was their signature line of swords, which involved importing hand-forged bare blades from China. They'd use locally cast fittings, make the grips, scabbards, and belts, and then assemble everything into one package. Valiant Armoury has had a reputation for high-quality leather work for quite some time, and their signature line was solidly mid-range in price, around $500 to $700 US. Within the last few years, however, VA has moved their focus to their Craftsman line, which the Hardwick is part of. Instead of importing the blades, these are shaped by Valiant Armoury themselves using stock removal methods and heat-treated in their own shop. I'm not sure if they outsource the fittings or do those themselves, but in general the Craftsman series is now roughly in the same price ballpark as Albion, although VA swords come with scabbards by default. One thing to watch out for if you happen to look for Valiant Armoury swords on the used market. Some of their older blades, whether from the signature line or another special collection line, have a very similar look and construction to their new Craftsman line. For instance, here's the Craftsman Cressy and the Special Collection Cressy. The two listings use the same photo because the swords are so similar, but the Special Collection version sold for $690 US, while the Craftsman sells for $1,295 US, both of them including a scabbard. One way that you can usually tell the difference is that the Craftsman series typically has the Valiant Armoury maker's mark on it, but Sunny has said to me that the earliest Craftsman swords did not always have that mark either. This sword is not marketed as a replica. In fact, it's not marketed at all that I can tell. It's not listed on Valiant Armoury's website, and the only listing it had on Cult of Athena went away when they recently updated their site. It's fairly similar to the VA Dugues. I'm sorry for that pronunciation, it's probably way off. But aside from the hilt furnishings being obviously different, the blade shape isn't the same either. I'm not sure if this was a special order by Cult of Athena, or perhaps a one-off by Valiant Armoury, or something else. In any case, Valiant Armoury doesn't market their swords as being representative of any specific oakshot type. In my opinion, the Hardwick is most similar to a Type 14 sword, which was a single-handed sword with a broad flat blade that sharply tapers to an acute point. They were used primarily in the late 13th to the mid-14th century and have a good balance between cutting and thrusting. A typical Type 14 has a lenticular cross-section past the fuller. This one is closer to a flattened diamond, though. I'll talk about that more when I get to the blade. Okay, let's dive into the sword and start with the pommel. This is representative of a Type J pommel, though an argument could be made for a Type K as well. These aren't hard and fast rules. It has an oval shape overall, and the raised boss in the center is circular. The pommel very slightly tapers in thickness, leading to some nice depth. The edges are all chamfered nicely, and I don't feel it biting into my hand when in use, which is not something I can say for very many disc pommels. Most of them cause at least a little discomfort for me. The pommel is peened to the tang, and the peen is pretty clean. There's a few marks here and there, but they're very minor, and it's clear Valiant Armoury put some time into making the peen attractive and well-formed. The polish on the pommel is a satin look that I appreciate. You can see the grind lines, especially in the sunlight, but they're nicely done and evenly ground. The grip is wood core, and the leather wrap has a fine cord texture that I really like, both for its looks and how it feels in the hand. There's a couple of risers that help center my hand on the grip, and the leather is very tightly bound against them. The leather feels good in the hand, and while the seam wavers around, it's completely unnoticeable when held. The shape of the grip is excellent. It's fairly broad with nice elliptical curves, and swells just a touch right where the palm of my hand rests, before tapering towards the pommel. I find the grip extremely well crafted and very easy to use. I never had the slightest issue indexing the blade. To top off the excellent form and function, I think the grip looks great as well. I love the blue dye Valiant Armoury used here. It's kind of a mottled blue that gives the grip a slightly worn texture without looking old. It's a great look and a great grip. The crossguard is a pretty classic example of a Type 6. It has upswept quillins that flare out and clean lines throughout. Like the pommel, the edges are all chamfered nicely, preventing any discomfort in use. The finish is pretty much the same as the pommel as well. There's some subtlety to the shaping of the crossguard you wouldn't notice from a straight-on picture. In this picture you can see the thickness tapers towards the end of the quillin. This is something a lot of budget sword makers can get wrong. Often you'll see a blocky crossguard that doesn't really have any dimension to it. This kind of attention to detail is really important, in my mind, to getting a sword that's right. On one side, the fit of the blade to the crossguard is pretty much perfect, with virtually no gap at all. The other side has a considerably larger gap, however, and it shows some unevenness in the lines of the crossguard. This isn't actually a problem, but for the price I paid for the sword, I would have liked a little better fit and finish here. Taking a look at the scabbard next. Like I said, Valiant Armoury has a reputation for quality leather work, and I think it shows through here. The leather feels of good, although not great, quality, and the overall design looks great. The blue dye matches the grip nicely, and the integrated belt really sets off the look. The fit of the scabbard to the blade is good, but it could be better. There's a very minor amount of rattle, but pretty much no retention at all. The sword will slide out when held upside down without any coaxing. This is mostly a matter of taste though. I prefer my scabbards to hold the sword snugly enough that I can hold it upside down without the blade sliding out. A gentle shake at that point, allowing it to come out, is what I like to see, but there's plenty of people out there that feel differently. Moving on to the business end, the blade. Here's the measurements I took of this sword. It's balanced at about 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters, and has a nice distal taper, with the thickness starting at 5 millimeters at the crossguard before rapidly tapering to 3.75 millimeters 10 inches up the blade. The distal taper then evens out for most of the rest of the blade before sharply tapering again near the tip. As I said before, the typical Type 14 sword has a lenticular cross-section after the fuller, whereas this one is closer to a flattened diamond. It doesn't have as strong a central ridge as a flattened diamond cross-section normally does though, so it's kind of a mix between that and lenticular. Note that this doesn't invalidate it from being representative of a Type 14 however, as the typologies are more rough guidelines than rigid rules. In records of the medieval sword, the first example of a Type 14 has a flattened diamond cross-section, which Oakeshott himself said should have classified as a Type 16, but he decided the overall shape fit much more firmly as a 14. The Hardwick's blade is very well formed, with straight, even lines throughout. There is sadly a bit of damage to the tip, but this is 100% my fault. When I was capturing the footage for this review, I apparently didn't lock one of the legs of my folding table, and it collapsed, sending the sword point first directly into the concrete. I'm frankly amazed at how little damage the sword took from my stupidity here. So props to Valiant Armoury, and a note to myself, pay more attention during setup. Anyway, the sword is polished to an even satin look that's smoother than the pommel and crossguard, and it borders on a mirror polish in certain light. It's an attractive look, but it does accentuate the minor scuffs and scratches caused by cutting. This isn't in any way an issue. Using a sword to cut is going to mark up the blade, no matter how well made. The fullers on the blade are nicely ground, with straight lines and clean terminations. If they terminate in a different place on either side, it's by a very minor amount. Looking down the length of the blade, I don't really see much, if any, rippling left over from grinding. This is a bit of fit and finish work that most production makers don't take the time to address. It's not something that would affect performance at all, but having very smooth, even planes on the blade really adds to the overall look. The sword comes sharp, and it's one smooth bevel all the way to the edge. This is a very well done blade geometry. I can't make out any sign of a micro bevel, and it's quite sharp, while still having some meat behind it to help with durability. When flexed, the blade shows a decent amount of stiffness, which should aid in thrusting, while still maintaining enough flexibility to help absorb impact shocks. it returns to true nicely. Before I talk about cutting performance, please keep in mind that I'm a complete novice when it comes to using a sword. I generally focus more on controlling the blade rather than adding much force to my strikes, although recently I've been experimenting with stepping strikes to hopefully help add some rotation of my core into the cuts. I still have a long way to go with my technique, however, and any failed cuts you see are far more likely to be my fault than the blades. With that disclaimer out of the way, there weren't really any failed cuts here. The sword performed beautifully. It cut through pool noodles with ease, delivering clean cuts with pretty much no tearing, except for one swing where I ended up rotating the blade during the cut. My fault there. Water bottles were similarly easy to cut. Now admittedly, they're not hard to cut in general. What I hope to see out of cutting them is clean cuts that leave the bottom of the bottle in place. Failing that, which I usually do, I'd like to see the bottom of the bottle not move that much. That indicates to me that the force of the strike was concentrated on the edge, and I kept the alignment generally correct during the cut. The Hardwick handled this excellently. Every water bottle I cut felt like it offered next to no resistance. The bottles didn't go flying afterwards, and I even managed one cut where the bottom stayed in place. Alright, time to talk bottom line. Was the sword worth it? In short, yes, I think it was. I really enjoy owning the sword. I love the look. The fit and finish is quite well done, and overall it's just a really good sword. I can't really say I recommend it to other people since it doesn't seem like Valiant Armoury is actually producing it, although I imagine if you contact Sonny he could probably make another. But if this sword is representative of the quality of the Craftsman series by VA, I think they're worth the hefty price tag. And that's going to wrap this review up. Thank you so much for watching. If you happen to enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. Until next time, Alien Toot out.